as I read it, three distinct interests, one of which is Roosevelt. And then there's another one, and then there's another one that you have a very deep interest in. Do you want to talk for just a couple minutes about some of the other things you've written about?
Yeah, so the book on Roosevelt is my most recent history book, but it's actually somewhat of a divergence from what I usually write, which is post-war American history. I wrote a book about the history of the Civil Rights Act. I also wrote a book, kind of a micro history of the week after Martin Luther King was assassinated. That's really the area that I know better. So really the 60s. But this book was kind of a fun jaunt to the side. And then I write about spirits and whiskey in particular. So I've written one book on American whiskey. I've written a book on Scotch, and I have another book on Kentucky whiskey, or whiskey making in Kentucky, coming out this fall.
I imagine those books are especially enjoyable to research.
They're a lot of fun.
So, well, good evening. I'm Lee Wright. Welcome. I'm near Boston, and with me is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of The Pursuit of History, the nonprofit that brings these History Camp discussions to you each week. Tonight, we are excited to welcome Clay Risen. He is a reporter at the New York Times, and he has worked for 10 years on the op-ed desk, including 4 years as deputy editor and as a senior editor on the politics desk, where he helped oversee coverage of the 2020 presidential campaign. Clay is also a highly regarded expert on whiskey. He is the best-selling author of 5 books, including most recently, The Impossible Collection of Whiskey, and our subject tonight, The Crowded Hour, Theodore Roosevelt, The Rough Riders, and the Dawn of the American Century. Thank you so much for joining us, Clay.
Thanks for having me.
So, Clay, this is such an interesting topic from a few different standpoints. I think it'd be helpful. Why don't we set the stage? Let's remind people about where Roosevelt is in his very illustrious life, and then maybe where the world is, that then we come upon then this clash called the Spanish-American War.
Sure. So Roosevelt, it's important, I think, first of all, to know that he was pretty old for a soldier going into this war. The war happened in 1898. And he was 38 years old at that time. He was, really going into middle age, and he was someone who felt the need to go to war, felt a real desire to, for patriotism, for adventure, for sort of personal, motivations. He had a real drive for it, and welcomed the war. But it wasn't something that you would expect out of someone of his age, and also someone of his background. He was wealthy. He came from a very well-off family in New York, a very long established family. He was a politician. He owned a ranch. He was a history writer. He was an adventurer, but he wasn't a military type. He had no military experience. He had worked in the federal government. He had worked in the state government in New York. But he was someone who really felt that the world might be passing him by. It's very interesting to read his writings at that time. We know that very soon after the Spanish-American War, he became governor of New York, and then very quickly after that, he became president of the United States. So we know that he is on the verge of greatness. But at the time, he, in his letters and in comments to friends, he felt that he was on the outs. He was at the immediate moment, he was the deputy or assistant, essentially the deputy secretary of the Navy. And he felt like that might be the best he ever accomplished. So that's kind of his context. Where the world was, the world was obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but it was in a certain amount of tumult. On the sort of long range, speaking of sort of long run terms, it was on the verge of World War One. It was sort of in the end of the first sort of colonial era, and it was the world itself, Europe, Japan, Russia. These countries were looking at the United States and wondering what was going on, where it was going to fit into this very delicate, very fragile world system that they had put together. The Japanese were also a threat to kind of that European sort of, very, very fragile status quo. And so the question was the United States going to become another country like Europe? Would it be something totally new, like Japan was turning out to be? And would it be a colonial power? Would it continue to be an isolationist power? And the United States was asking itself these questions. Was the United States going to be a country that followed the European model and went out and conquered colonies and built commercial empires with its military, fought with other European countries, relied on a large military presence domestically and foreign? Or would it be an isolationist power? Would it be a country that it had been for much of the 19th century? Very inward-looking, very, very much relying on its the waters on either side, the oceans on either side of the continent to protect it from outside threats. And or would it be a country that somehow found a new path forward, that was engaged with the world, but also not in the way that Europe had engaged with the world, engaged with the world on its own terms, on the terms that had inspired the American Revolution, that had really driven the America of the 19th century, a country that was at least like to think of itself as a country built on Enlightenment ideas, on ideas of individualism and patriotism, but ultimately sort of small r civic republicanism, and all those questions for the country, for the world, and for Roosevelt himself came to a head in 1898.
So let's perhaps dive a little deeper into what brought this about. I think people probably remember the Maine. We weave this together because there was some time period, right, that elapsed between incidents like that and ultimate declaration, as I recall.
Sure. So the question of what the United States was going to do about Cuba was actually pretty had gone on for a long time. In fact, it was almost as old as the Republic itself. Thomas Jefferson had contemplated trying to buy Cuba from the Spanish as early as it was the Jefferson administration, and occasionally throughout the 19th century that question would come up. So Polk considered it, Grant considered it, considered making offers to Spain. Can we buy Cuba? And Spain always said no. Cuba was precious to Spain. It was not only the first island, the first foothold that Spain had made in the Western Hemisphere as it expanded its empire. It was the home of Havana, which was one of the largest cities in the Spanish Empire, including in Spain itself. And it was home to hundreds of thousands of people who really they identified themselves as Spanish, who happened to be living in Cuba. And as the 19th century progressed, the rest of the empire fell apart, so that by the end of it, Spain only had Cuba and Puerto Rico as its holdings in the Western Hemisphere. So it was very resistant, very reluctant to even consider giving it up. But what started to happen at the end of the 19th century was Cubans did not want to stick with Spain. And so there was a series of wars, insurrections, pretty bloody, violent. Today we would call them genocidal wars by the Spanish against insurrectionists in Cuba, and hundreds of thousands of Cubans died in concentration camps and forced starvations and mass executions. A lot of the things that we associate with the horrors of the 20th century took place in Cuba at the end of the 19th century. And the United States and Americans watched all of this happen. We knew what was going on. And increasingly, the American people became very concerned and very worried about, first of all, would this spill over? Was this something, no one wants to have conflict like this on their border. I mean, Cuba's not literally on the border, but it's 70 miles from Florida. So it's practically next door. But also there was a strong moral component. So a lot of Americans looked at what was happening in Cuba and they saw themselves. And they saw an analog to what Americans had gone through a century before. They said, look, here's an evil or whatever you want to call it. Here's a wicked European power oppressing an innocent Western hemispheric population, and they are fighting for their liberty. And just like the French helped us out, we should help out the Cubans. And a lot of people of different backgrounds saw this as a motivation. Labor leaders saw this as fundamentally a fight by indigenous workers against the powers, the moneyed powers of Spain. African Americans saw the number of, a large number of Afro-Cubans fighting for liberty, and they said, we see ourselves there. A lot of religious groups saw what was going on as fundamentally a religious conflict, or they saw it in religious terms. And so going up to 1898, when the war took place, that was the context, and there was an increasing amount of pressure on politicians to do something about it. So William McKinley was president. He had been elected in 1896, and he had run on a fairly hands-off policy toward Cuba. But McKinley often doesn't get the credit he deserves for being a very savvy, very good president, I think. And one of the things that he understood that he had to do was to try to resolve this tension in the United States, because there were a lot of people who also felt that it was none of our business to get involved. And a lot of the political class and a lot of the business class felt it is none of our business to get involved in Spain. We don't want a war. We don't want the costs involved. This is Spain's problem, and we shouldn't do anything about it. And so McKinley understood that he had to do something about it. He was also, he was a very religious man. He felt a very strong religious motivation, moral compunction to do something. So he tried a diplomatic route, and it got to the point where he was really pushing Spain. And in early 1898, he sent the Maine, which was one of our new battleships. He sent the Maine to Havana Harbor, really as just kind of a show of force, a sort of way to say, without ever making anything explicit, we're doing diplomacy now, but if you don't come to the table, we also have battleships.
So, I think when people talk about Cuba today, of course, they think of the relations that we have today. At that time, was there substantial trade back and forth? Were there people moving back and forth, either visiting relatives, these sorts of things? So closer connections, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. The Cuban American, or the Cuban population, the Cuban Americans, as well as just temporary workers in the United States, particularly in Florida and in some of the large cities on the East Coast, there were a lot of Cubans, and they had communities, they had civil groups, civic organizations, and one of the things pushing us, the United States, toward getting involved in Cuba was activism by these Cuban American groups pushing for something to happen. And they would go around the country on speaking tours, raising funds for Cuban refugees, for Cuban children, which really raised awareness on the part of non-Cuban Americans that there was a crisis, and a humanitarian crisis on their border. There was also an enormous amount of investment. The United States had a lot of money invested in Cuban agriculture and mining in Cuba. And I said earlier that the business community was against the war, and they were up until a point. There was a point where the conflict in Cuba got so bad that the business community realized that only some sort of intervention on the part of the United States, a diplomatic intervention, military intervention, could bring things back to the kind of stability that a business would need to have. And so there's a cold calculation going on the part of the business community, and also a lot of people, let's say Wall Street, once it became apparent that war was going to happen, they saw a lot of opportunity to take advantage of a post-Spain a free Cuba. So there was, and in fact, the place where the Rough Riders and the American invasion landed in Cuba was the site of an old, to call a port would be too complimentary, but it was a set of piers that an American mining company had used to load ore onto ships. But because of the fighting in Spain, or the fighting in Cuba, they had been abandoned. So the Americans landed in a site where there had been lots of Americans a decade before, and now it was a ghost town.
So take us up to what happened and how Roosevelt got involved. The story of how he put that group together, I think, is fascinating. And when we get to that point, we probably need to go back and maybe talk about some of his experiences in North Dakota. So many Easterners, where's their ranch or their farm? Well, it's in Connecticut or something, right? This was actually in the West.
Yeah. So Roosevelt. So real quick. So Roosevelt was one of these people that was pushing for the war, and he had a variety of motivations, ideological motivations, personal motivations, but he was there in Washington. He knew McKinley. He knew all the players, and he was an advocate for war, and not just diplomatic intervention, but real war. And when the Maine exploded in February of 1898, he was one of the people who jumped to the conclusion that it was either Spain had attacked the Maine, or it was some form of negligence. Maybe a water mine had exploded accidentally. But in either case, the Spanish were to blame. Now it turns out that that's not the case. It was an accident. But Roosevelt was one of the people who really grabbed onto that and said, "See, this is why we can't work with the Spanish. This is why we can't trust them. We need war." Now it still took several months before McKinley declared war, and ultimately he declared war for really because the diplomatic path had come to an end, and there was really no backing out of some form of conflict with Spain. So it was almost just a lack of options that led him to declare war, but also a sense that the country was really behind him. And he was a very conservative, a very risk-averse president, and so he really waited until he knew that almost everyone was behind him, and then he declared war. Now, there was a problem with declaring war, which was that America didn't really have an army. We think of America as being a country with a huge military, but in the 19th century, aside from moments like the Mexican War or the Civil War, when we rapidly built up military force, we really didn't have a military. In fact, we had by law a bare bones 28,000 soldiers in the army. And we had the Navy was a little better, but not much. And so when war was declared against Spain, we had to get up in arms, literally, very quickly. And so Roosevelt's answer to that, his suggestion was, why don't we, here's a crazy idea, we'll arm a bunch of cowboys and miners and college athletes and veterans and just anybody who has a certain set of skills that might lend them to being trained really quickly and sent off to war. And that's not a complete solution, but maybe it'll be a bridge between the troops that we have now and the troops that we have to train to go to war. And McKinley said yes. That's actually, he thought it was a great idea. And so there were 3 of these regiments that were created. They were all cavalry regiments. Only one of them went to Spain. Only one of them really mattered. And partly that was because Theodore Roosevelt was in charge of it. He resigned his job at the Navy Department, and he became the lieutenant colonel, so the deputy of the regiment, behind his best friend, Colonel Leonard Wood. And they put together a regiment of volunteer cavalrymen. And it was it's such a strange story. I mean, if it hadn't happened in real life, someone would have made a movie out of it, because it's so it's fascinating. The characters involved are fascinating because by definition they were looking for people who were either in large part were sort of outside of normal society, people who lived on the frontier, who lived in mining camps their whole lives, or who a lot of them were veterans or people who had been cops or worked in a variety of sort of very physically demanding environments. But then a number of them were college athletes, were people that Roosevelt knew very well, or knew as a type very well from his time in college, his love of college sports. And he believed that these were, and also his just very sort of upper class elitist idea about sort of the 19th century American male, that these were people, and he wasn't wrong. Most of those men were made for fantastic soldiers. These were men like the number 1 and the number 2 tennis players in the country, who had started off. One played at Cornell, and the other one, I forget where he played. But they were they're both now in the Tennis Hall of Fame. They quit tennis to become Rough Riders, and they both did, acquitted themselves very well. But it's amazing also that they pulled it off. The Rough Riders did really well in the war, and they fought as hard and as long, and they died in as great numbers as regular soldiers.
Well, let's talk about the famous charge. And wasn't there's some issue? Do you remember Gatling guns? Was there some issue with that, or is that?
Well, the Spanish did have some machine guns. One of the reasons why the war, or why the battle played out the way it did, was the United States. This is the Battle of San Juan Hill, and it was essentially what was meant to be the climactic battle of this campaign, where the United States, American soldiers, were attacking the outskirts of Santiago, which is one of the major cities in Cuba. It's the main city in the southwest side, and it was also where the Spanish fleet was holed up. So there was a feeling that the first place we have to attack is Santiago, so that we can also take control. We can destroy the fleet. And so about 16,000 American soldiers were set to attack this city. And the Americans hadn't really planned out much of an attack. But meanwhile, the Spanish were very well entrenched along a series of hills, with San Juan Hill as the main one. And they were entrenched, they were well prepared. And it was turning out that morning when the Americans attacked, and they had to come down a very narrow road and then spread out along a riverbed that then looked across a plain and then up to the hills. The Americans were just pinned down. The amount of gunfire coming down from the Spanish was devastating, and they were all losing men to not just to gunfire, but it was well over 100 degrees. It was incredibly hot. This was the end of June, 1898. It's very hot in Cuba, and they were wearing, what's worse, they were wearing their winter uniforms. There was no tropical uniform for American soldiers, so it wasn't, they weren't wearing parkas or something, but they were wearing wool uniforms, and so they were just drowning in sweat. And so Roosevelt, and then communications was bad. The general in charge had gotten sick with gout, and so there was really no leadership. And so Roosevelt was essentially left to his own with his men in that little stretch that they occupied along this riverbed. And at a certain point, he realized that there was a jungle behind them. There was with no escape. They were dropping one by one from the Spanish fire, and that the only way to get out of it was essentially to run into the gunfire, and to hope that the shock of seeing all of these men running up a hill toward the trenches would be a surprise, and that enough of them would survive to capture the hill. And so he yelled charge, and at first not a lot of people followed him, but very, very slowly, and then very quickly, hundreds and hundreds of men, not only from his regiment, not only from the Rough Riders, but from other regiments around him, all started running up this hill. And in fact, the hill that they ran up was not San Juan Hill. It was a hill next to it. And when they got to the top of it, Roosevelt could look out and see swarms, thousands of American soldiers all along this riverbed and this plain, starting to rise up and run up the other hills. And he realized that either they were all following him or they all had the same idea at the same time. But essentially, this insane idea, born of an insane situation, ended up winning the day.
Fascinating. So, so often there's something becomes legend, and then over time, while there one group of people that's enthusiastic, later there becomes another group that does everything it can to discover the real truth and so forth. So in this case, it sounds to me from your telling that Roosevelt did lead the charge in the face of all this fire.
Yeah, I mean, it's the fog of war, and it's difficult to say, was he the very first to lead a charge? Did someone else have the idea first? It's not something that can really be resolved. There's no question from eyewitnesses that he led the charge of the Rough Riders up this hill, and they could identify him because he was the only one on a horse. Even though the Rough Riders were a cavalry regiment, everyone except a few officers like Roosevelt had to leave their horses back in Florida, where they left on ships. And so everyone else was running. So it was very easy to see which one Roosevelt was. And he was on his horse right in front. And so that's pretty well documented. Now, what ended up happening was, and this is to no fault of Roosevelt, but there were no photographs. People were not videotaping what was going on. So a lot of it was left up to artists' embellishment. And so one of the common images you see is today, and is both was a common trope at the time, and even more so later on, was that all the Rough Riders were on horses, and they were all charging up this hill. And then it was taken as truth that, it was a cavalry charge. And then when people find out, it wasn't a cavalry charge, is this all? What else was a lie? When in fact, no one ever said it was a cavalry charge, but artists and then other people embellished from there. So it's more of a game of telephone than a
sure.
sort of founding myth.
Sure. So why don't we play out then to the conclusion, and then I think it'd be interesting to talk about how this experience may have shaped Roosevelt's worldview, and also what happened to the world following this. Some of the major changes that we saw.
Sure. So after the Battle of San Juan Hill was the climactic battle of the Santiago campaign, but it wasn't the end of the Santiago campaign. What followed was a pretty grueling siege by the American forces, and I should also say there were a good number of Cuban insurrectionists, Cuban freedom fighters, who were there with them. The Americans didn't treat them very well and really relegated them to a sort of second class, jobs. So they weren't on the front lines, but they were there. And so the Americans spent the better part of a month entrenched on these hills that surrounded Santiago, and knowing that there were tens of thousands of Spanish soldiers in the city, and really just not knowing, was it worth it to try to attack the city or just to wait it out? The problem was that summer was setting in, the rainy season was coming. The Americans didn't have very good supply lines. The number of soldiers, American soldiers, who were coming down with pretty terrible tropical diseases. If I say malaria was the least of their problems, and it was yellow fever was the killer, but almost all of them had malaria at some point. But the ones who got yellow fever died. Most of them did, and those that didn't lost an enormous amount of weight. There was one point where the Rough Riders, when they came home and they were disembarking, there were all these journalists from national papers waiting for them to come off, as well as hundreds of onlookers. And they were all expecting this, these sort of glorious legionnaires to come off, almost like, you know, Norse gods walking down and in fact, what came down the plank were these emaciated, some of them, you know, on stretchers coming off the ship. And that's what all of these thousands and thousands of American soldiers were going through. And what's striking is that the Spanish never understood that. They never really took into account that the Americans were, could be played for time. And ultimately the Spanish surrendered. And you know, I think ultimately they probably wanted to surrender. I don't think they wanted to be there much longer. And this was a way to essentially say, we've been defeated, we still have our honor, and we're gone. At that point, there was a lot of talk of having of another campaign of attacking Havana. There was a campaign, a separate campaign in Puerto Rico, where a lot of, not the Rough Riders, but a lot of other soldiers went. The Rough Riders all went home. A lot of the first wave of soldiers all went home because they were so battle worn. And then, you know, eventually the Spanish, rather than suffer more defeats, simply conceded. And that fall, they surrendered, and by December there was a peace treaty. So the war was very short. You know, even its broadest span, it's, you know, we're talking about seven or 8 months, but the consequences of it were enormous. First of all, obviously, Spain no longer had any Western Hemisphere holdings, and the United States was really in command of the Western Hemisphere. You know, Roosevelt would later declare the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where he said, not only is no other country is allowed to intervene, no European country can intervene in the Western Hemisphere, but we reserve the right to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. So if something's going wrong, the United States will invade. We declare that as our right. So the United States really took on a sort of quasi-colonial or quasi-imperial stance with regards to the Western Hemisphere. The United States also won control of the Philippines, which was an unintended consequence of the war. The United States had originally sent a fleet to Manila simply to destroy the Spanish fleet, because there was worry that if we don't destroy the Spanish fleet, they will attack Hawaii, they'll attack San Francisco, who knows what's going to happen. So we need to neutralize them. But as soon as we did that, the Spanish simply folded, and they conceded the Philippines to the United States, which then became this sort of game of chess where it was de facto an American colony. And the United States didn't want to give up the Philippines, because if we gave up the Philippines, maybe the Germans or the British would take control, and we don't want that. And also there was a strong streak of sort of colonial white man's burden sort of sentiment, especially when the Filipinos rose up in insurrection against us, and some of the worst, bloodiest, and really most sort of vilest American portion of the war, if you consider that part of the war, occurred in the Philippines, where the Americans did a lot of the things to the Filipinos that we had condemned the Spanish for doing to the Cubans. So there's a lot of irony baked in there. But one of the upshots of all this was for the rest of the world to see the United States as truly as a rising global power, and one that was going to go about its business in a different way than the rest of the Europe and other military powers. That we were, despite having taken control of a number of colonies, we were not necessarily looking to get more. We were going to go about our empire building in a somewhat different way, but we were a force to be reckoned with. I mean, we beat the Spanish. The Spanish were, Spain was not what it used to be in 1898, but it was still an imperial power, and the United States beat Spain with one arm tied behind its back. So it was really that first moment where the rest of the world really took notice of what the United States could be, and it's one of the reasons why the subtitle for the book is "The Dawn of the American Century." It's not the heyday, it's not the beginning. The American century really picks up at World War II. But a lot of the themes and a lot of the identities that America moved into through the 20th century really had their beginnings in 1898.
And we talked about the war being relatively short. What was the time period between Roosevelt signing up, getting to Cuba, and then ultimately leaving Cuba?
So really it's 5 months. So he signed up in early May, and by the end of August, early September, he was back in New York. And he had already very quietly started laying the groundwork for running for governor. And the idea, what they had to do, everyone returning from Cuba had to go through Long Island, the eastern end of Long Island, for quarantine, because they all had tropical diseases, and very, wisely, they couldn't be simply sent back to their homes yet. So the Rough Riders, along with thousands and thousands of other soldiers, spent a few weeks in camp at the end of Long Island, and then sort of slowly trickled back through New York City, where they were celebrated. I mean, that was where really the cultural phenomenon of the Rough Riders really came to a head. I mean, one of the things that I try to draw out through the book is the cultural significance of the Rough Riders and how important they were as a moment. The whole country was so invested in this war. Ultimately, 1 million men volunteered to fight in the Spanish-American War, but so many people around them, so many Americans wanted the war, celebrated the war, followed the war very closely in the newspapers, and just like we would do today, they were looking for heroes, and they were looking for stories. And the Rough Riders and Theodore Roosevelt and a number of individual Rough Riders provided those stories and provided those heroes, so that when they came back to New York, they were seen as, despite having come off the boat in a pretty battle-worn state, by the time they got to New York City, they were like gods, and they couldn't pay for a drink or a theater seat or a meal. Everyone in the city just turned out to meet them and to shake hands. Fashion style, they affected fashion styles that fall. There was a women's hat. There was sort of it was a fur hat that had this sort of military. It was sort of like a beret kind of thing, but it was supposed to be this sort of quasi-military thing. And it was called the Rough Rider, and that was a popular fashion item to have in New York and Boston and Chicago in the fall of 1898. So they had a huge impact. And of course, Roosevelt simply walked into the governor's office. There was no real question that as soon as he said he wanted to be governor, that he wouldn't win that seat.
Yeah, he as I recall, he'd been in the state assembly before that too, right?
Yes.
And like police commissioner and so forth. So it kind of known to the people of New York in a few different perspectives, and then comes home a hero, right?
Yeah, no, he was very much a New York, a son of New York. He was someone who was, not only had he represented the city and the state assembly, he had run for mayor. He had unsuccessfully, but he had run for mayor. He was an intellectual figure in the city. People understood that he was someone who lived in the city and sort of, spoke at events, and so he was just known around the city in official and unofficial capacities. And as you said, he was police commissioner for a while. And so when he ran for governor, he probably would have had a really good shot had he not been, had he not been with the Rough Riders. But the Rough Riders simply gave him this gilded edge that no one else had.
So there's one small thing that I remember, and just tell me if I'm remembering this correctly. He had his uniform made at Brooks Brothers. Do I remember that right?
Yeah, no, that's true. There's one, it deserves explanation. At the time, officers didn't get their own uniforms. Officers had to pay for their own uniforms. And Brooks Brothers, while a very well-known, Brooks Brothers was a fine clothier at the time. That's what Brooks Brothers did. Brooks Brothers got its start as a supplier of uniforms during the Civil War. And so by 1898, especially if you lived in New York, if you were an officer, you went to Brooks Brothers. That's simply, and especially if you had money, that's where you went. So it wasn't like he had lots of options or that there was anything actually sort of untoward about it. It's only in retrospect we look back and we think, well, Brooks Brothers, why would he do that?
So Clay, that's a great example. Your one earlier about, as you characterized it, kind of the game of telephone and wait a minute, maybe it wasn't done that way. Well, no one thought it really took place that way. And this too, because I mentioned this to someone else. Wow, Roosevelt, so wealthy, got his kind of wealthy, entitled or whatever, had his uniform made at Brooks Brothers. And here indeed we'd say, well, that would be a logical place for anyone to have gone to get his uniform.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really noteworthy, and I think one of the reasons why the Rough Riders, the soldiers, loved him. I mean, he was, from the very beginning, they loved him. And one of the reasons why they loved him from the very beginning is he showed up. They did their training in San Antonio. There was a big military installation there, and there are a bunch of reasons why they chose San Antonio. But he arrived a little late. He had a bunch of business in D.C. to take care of. So he arrived toward the tail end of the assembly period when all the men were gathering. And when he got to San Antonio, there was it's still there, but at the time it was the Menger Hotel, which is still a very nice hotel in San Antonio. At the time, it was the place to stay. And so when he arrived, he went to the Menger. He was meeting. That was the meeting point where he was coming off the train. And then he would be met by some officers, and they would take him out to San Antonio, out to the base. And the owner of the Menger came out and said, Mr. Roosevelt, we would be honored if you would stay with us. And you can stay with us, and then you can have a hot bath and a meal and a warm bed, and in the morning you can get up and go out to the camp and do your thing, but then come back and we'll take care of you. And Roosevelt said, very politely, but he said, absolutely not. There's no way that I'm going to separate myself from my men. If I'm going to tell them to risk their lives in battle, if I'm going to tell them to sleep on the floor, then I need to do those things. And he did that without any military training. This was just instinct on his part. The idea, the sense that that's the thing to do, the right thing to do, both for the men, but also to win their respect. And he was absolutely right. And the men from the very beginning were so impressed with him as a leader. And he demonstrated that kind of selflessness throughout the campaign.
I have one other question, and then we'll ask Carrie to join us. He wrote a number of books, and I think most people will be surprised at the number of the books and the quality of the books. Did he ever write about this?
Yes, yeah, actually, it's one of the challenges of writing, or a challenge I found was that he wrote a very good memoir of the period called The Rough Riders. And I should say, this is one of the funny things about that. The Rough Riders was the nickname. That was not obviously the name of the regiment. And Roosevelt had really hated the name at the beginning. The term Rough Riders, it was taken from, it was a style of show in a Wild West show. Essentially, guys who could ride horses without saddles, right, and do tricks. And so when journalists started calling the regiment the Rough Riders, Roosevelt was very taken aback. He said, well, we're not a circus show. We are a military regiment, and we deserve that respect. But then he very quickly realized that people really loved the name Rough Riders, and it was really a positive. And so not only did he sort of stand back and let that be the name, but then he ended up naming his memoirs of the campaign, The Rough Riders. And it's really good. I mean, it's not Grant's memoirs. It's not, the most amazing piece of military memoir you're going to find, but it's really good. It's very compelling. And it's a great document. It's both a document that shows insight into his way of thinking, but it was also a pretty reliable record of the fighting. So it was very, it's one of the books. Some of his books are not very good. He's let's say he's above average generally, but he wrote so much that he has some clunkers. but the Rough Riders is first class in his body of work.
Yeah, I find it remarkable that a man of such accomplishment, right? All of these positions he held and so forth, had time to write not a book, right? Not two, not three, but book after book after book. Carrie, come join us. And I want to point something out to folks. Maybe switch the pictures so we've got a little bit larger picture of you for a minute. People who have been tuning in, and we've occasionally had questions about this. Carrie had a beautiful kind of pen and ink picture behind her. There's now something very different. And what it is a limited edition print. So folks watching may know that History Camp is a project of a nonprofit organization started a couple of years ago called The Pursuit of History. And one of our initiatives is to recognize great historic sites. And so we had commissioned, in the style of those famous WPA era National Park Service posters, we had one commissioned recognizing this great historic site, Fort Ticonderoga. And we announced it just a couple of weeks ago. It's silkscreen. They're all signed, numbered, 12 color silkscreen available either as a print or as a framed item. And the proceeds go to support what we're doing with the Pursuit of History and with History Camp and things like this evening's talk. So, Carrie, if people want to learn more about that print, where would they go?
You can go to the pursuitofhistory.org and you'll see it right on the front. You click into that and learn all about it.
Great. Questions?
All right. So one question is, did this Spanish-American War sort of bring the country back together to any degree after the Civil War?
That's a great question. One of the things that really marks the latter part of the 19th century is several striking divisions in the country. First of all is the sectional division. The war was over, but it really continued in a lot of ways to operate like two countries. The Southerns, the former Confederate states, and the Union states would still eyed each other very warily, even though they governed together. They were all represented in Congress. And there was a real sense, I found it very striking, how much the war represented a conciliation between the two. And in fact, there was, I found images in magazines, and actually some magazines ran a lot more poetry back then, and bad poetry, not, we're not talking about New Yorker quality poetry. This is stuff that, it's doggerel, really. But people would, I found multiple poems about these kind of allegories of, two ships or two bulls or, whatever, that had long been fighting. And then they were challenged by another bull or something. And so they decided to fight, it's very, but this idea that the war was something that would unite the two sides. The same thing with labor and the sort of capitalist class. The 1890s had seen the worst depression up until that point in American history, and the after effects of that were felt very, very strongly among working classes, and people felt really that there needed to be something that would focus the country outward and really unite all class. And in fact, the Rough Riders were seen as really an avatar of this, because they included, both college athletes, Ivy League kids, some of the, children of some of the wealthiest families in America, Roosevelt among them, and people that grew up in dirt poor conditions were, cowboys and miners and whatnot. There was also immigration was another issue that had been roiling the country. The number of immigrants who had come in the previous, decade or two. It was as we understand today, it's socially, it can be socially disruptive. It brings change, and there was also the sense that the war would help, Americanize, bring different ethnic groups together. And again, the Rough Riders were celebrated as, you know, in a very narrow sense, for their diversity. Now, the Army was segregated. There were no African Americans in the unit, but there were Native Americans, there were German Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, you know, all of these groups that at the time were understood to be very, very distinct and often very much in tension. And so in that way as well, the war was seen as something that would bring them together.
Okay, thank you. So one of the stories that I liked in your book was about the regimental chaplain who Roosevelt had sent to Siboney, if I'm pronouncing that right, to buy food. And he came back with a whole wagon load of food. And Roosevelt asked him, wow, how'd you pull that off? And he says, well, there were all these men filling all these carts of food, and this one didn't have a driver, so I supplied the need and drove off. And I appreciate that because that reminded me very much of my granddad and his World War II stories, and he pulled off capers like that. What other stories did you come across as you were researching this that you enjoyed?
You know, I really enjoyed, you know, there was a story about, you know, there were so many stories about Roosevelt's selflessness, and yet also he was the only guy who came back from the fighting having put on weight. He somehow managed to get through combat and the siege without losing any stamina. And so he would take the men out on hikes when they were on their siege. You know, whenever someone wasn't on the line, he would make sure they were getting exercise. And of course, many of them resented it. I mean, they understood what he was doing, but you know, they just wanted to rest. They wanted to chill out. You know, I'd say related to the story you told, you know, there are a number of stories where Roosevelt was challenged by the authorities in one way or the other, you know, for you know, taking on too much food or you know, going against military regulations. One of my favorites is that when they were at camp in San Antonio and they were training, he was leading an afternoon march, and it was a grueling march. It was very hot in San Antonio, and so they came back, and outside of camp, some enterprising San Antonians had set up little bars, you know, just tents with a cask of beer. And so he came by that and he said, you know, you guys have done a great job today. I am going to buy everyone beer. You know, tabs on me. Just don't get drunk, right? Have as much beer as you want, but anyone who gets drunk will have to answer to me. So they all, you know, and you know, I think they generally were pretty responsible. There's no record of them getting drunk. But that evening, Leonard Wood, who at the time was still in charge of the regiment, he had his officers at their mess that night, and he started saying, well, I'm not going to name names here, but I understand that one of my officers bought beer for some of his soldiers, and that is unacceptable in my regiment. And I hope that whoever did that understands that he has no place in my regiment if he keeps doing it. And then he got up and left. And Roosevelt followed him and said, he said, Colonel, I have but one thing to say. I believe I have been the damnedest ass in this regiment, and I apologize. Good evening. And he walked off. And Wood forgave him, and it was all fine. But the men loved him for it because he knew that was not you weren't supposed to do that. But you know, he thought they deserved it.
Definitely. All right. Okay, we have a question from a viewer who says, Roosevelt called the Spanish-American War the splendid little war, but I understand the death of Roosevelt's son Kermit in World War I colored or cooled Roosevelt's enthusiasm for war. Can you comment on that?
Well, absolutely. And I think that Roosevelt came out of the war with a different attitude. You know, he was a very complex figure, obviously. He's someone who went into the war, you know, as a full-on jingoist. He was very supportive of the war, really wanted to fight himself. I think he came out of it somewhat not jaded, but somewhat more realistic about what war is. But nevertheless, when World War I came around, and by then he had been president, and he was in sort of semi-retirement, as much as Roosevelt could be in retirement. But he supported World War I. He wanted the United States to get into the war much earlier than it did, and he pushed all of his children, all of his boys, to join the war. And yes, and one of his sons died in combat. He was a pilot. His plane was shot down, and it was not long before Roosevelt died. It was only it was less than 2 years before his death, but it absolutely ruined him. And it ruined him. I think one of the things a theme that runs through Roosevelt's life is his relationship with his wife, and his second wife. His first wife died relatively young, but his second wife and his relationship with her, and his utter commitment to her, but a commitment that didn't keep him from doing all the things that he did. And one of the things I think is one of the very, very sad things about Roosevelt is that it took the death of his son to realize the consequences of his passions for his wife. Because one of the things he took note of in his diaries and in conversations was how heartbroken he was over how heartbroken she was. And it's something that honestly he could have seen much earlier. He went off to the Spanish-American War when she was very ill, and he had no compunction about going to war. And it never seems to have really appreciated that she was fine with that. Now, people were different back then, but nevertheless, and I think had he lived longer, I'm curious. I mean, we'll never know, but it would be interesting just to sort of think about, would he have been a different person in the long run after the death of his son? Would he think about war differently? I don't know.
Thank you. All right, we have a viewer who would like you to talk a little bit about the number of men that died from disease. She says, I have a letter from an uncle that was excited about coming home, but he died a week later from sickness.
Yeah, so more men died of disease than of their battlefield wounds. So, and that's especially because, as I said, after the Battle of San Juan Hill, there really wasn't much shooting. There was a little bit of shooting, but generally it was a siege. And then after that, the men stayed, even after the siege was over. They stayed in these conditions. And very few of them moved into the city. They still stayed in camps. And they were completely unprepared. And the military was unprepared for illness. One of the saving graces was the presence of Clara Barton and the Red Cross. They were there as sort of a paramilitary hospital organization. I mean, they were very much in the battlefield, taking care of men and providing what comfort and medicine they could. But nevertheless, there was really nothing to prevent them from getting not just malaria and yellow fever, but all sorts of diseases born from malnutrition. The food that they had was all canned meats and beans and hardtack and things that were really pretty unpalatable anywhere, but were designed for the high plains and for conditions in the United States. These were not foods that you want to eat when it's 110 degrees outside, and then there were some things the men could eat, some foods, local foods that they could eat, but generally speaking, they didn't really know how to prepare them. And so malnutrition itself was a problem, and that leads to disease. So a number of Rough Riders came back and either had permanent health damage or they died very soon afterward. The viewer's uncle's situation is not uncommon. A lot of people came back only to try to convalesce and never to recover.
Okay, thank you. Well, this has been a riveting subject, and we've had a great conversation tonight. Thank you so much. We have a copy or a link to Clay's book in the chat, so check that out. Of course, as always, there's so much more to learn in there than we were able to cover in this short time tonight. You can find out how to join us as a member of the Pursuit of History on thepursuitofhistory.org if you would like to support History Camp. And we also just announced today our spring season. You can go to historycamp.org and download that flyer and find out all the details for the upcoming sessions that we have. Next week, March 25th, we will be talking with Rosalind Elder about the legacy of African Americans in Massachusetts and the United States. Hope to see you then. Have a good night.
Night.
Night.